The talk that I'm going to be presenting, whose title you see has migrated a little bit from the original formulation, which was cast initially in terms of the making of what I termed vernacular Muslim identities in Europe and North America, to a more explicit focus on public culture, religious authority in Islam in the West. This presentation is, rather than being based on research that is complete and has been kind of out there and published and discussed and such, this is kind of a presentation from the mid-course of a new book that I'm working on right now, whose tentative title is The Other Radical Islam. And it's looking at the changing nature of Islamic activism and social movements. For those of you interested in the sort of academic vectors of the book, it draws on new social movement theory, specifically the work of the Italian social theorist Alberto Melucci, to understand what I take to be some central reconfigurations that are occurring today in terms of where we need to look to understand the changing nature of Islamic social activism and social movements. Much of the emphasis in the study of contemporary Islamic social movements and activism, and certainly political parties, has tended to focus on a fairly narrow ecology of groups and organizations. These are primarily either ideological movements, such as the Muslim Brotherhood, the Ikhwan al-Muslimin, or its South Asian variant, the Jamaat-e-Islami, hailing from South Asia, or to focus on what are often portrayed as fairly narrow theological schools of thought, Salafiyya, Deobandi, etc., etc., etc. What I'm doing in this study is to explore the ways in which particularly young Muslims in the world today, and in this work particularly young Muslims living in the United Kingdom, are encountering and consuming Islam and religious knowledge in what I take to be different ways, and to suggest that this different kind of engagement with religion is having concomitant effects on how it is that the very nature of Islamic social activism and collective mobilization is changing. The book is also kind of set up, again, for those of you interested in its theoretical valences, it's framed explicitly as a critique of the French scholar Olivier Roy and his thesis on what he terms post-Islamism. And the sort of short and somewhat caricatured version of Olivier Roy's thesis is to say that because traditional Islamist movements of the Muslim Brotherhood sort have failed thus far to capture state power in any part of the Muslim world, or to really emerge as true mass movements, political Islam as a project has failed. And Olivier Roy locates this failure, furthermore, in the shift that he points to in recent years towards a tendency among Muslims towards a more inward, privatized practice of religion that focuses more on issues of personal piety, i.e., am I being a good Muslim? Am I, quote-unquote, doing Islam in the right way? And he says that this shift towards a kind of personalized, individualized approach to religion is further evidence of the decline of the salience of collective mobilization in the name of Islam. What I'm trying to do in this book is to suggest that Olivier Roy is half correct. He's correct in terms of his identification of a shift towards a more personalized, individualized idiom of religion. But I suggest that he's dead wrong in saying that what we're witnessing, therefore, is a death, a decline, a diminution, a disappearance of interest in collective action in the name of Islam. Rather, what I'm trying to suggest is that the nature of Islamic and Islamist mobilization is undergoing some important changes today. So the central theme of my talk today, which again empirically is focused primarily on British Muslim youth settings, and this is deriving from largely ethnographic work that I've done, participant observation work, a lot of personal interviews, a lot of focus group interviews conducted in the UK between roughly 2004 and last year. The central theme of my talk today is to look at the consumption of religious knowledge and its translation into public Islam. Before kind of getting into some of the nitty-gritty, and also before getting into the fun stuff, i.e. cool sheikhs and hip-hop, which I promise will feature prominently, but you have to go through some boring stuff with me before we get there. I go through all the fun stuff actually fairly quickly towards the end, but I'm gonna take you through some history first. The backdrop against which this story plays out is a story of certain generational shifts within Muslim communities in the UK, aspects of which I would argue are also present and relevant to the American Muslim community, but that's a different talk, and that's a different story. You may well know, of course, that there are very significant differences between the profiles of American immigrant Muslims and immigrant Muslims in Europe that make that story play out in different ways. And again, maybe we can get into that later in our discussion following the talk. But the generational differences that I'm talking about here primarily are a shift within the younger generation. And by the younger generation, I mean those second and third generation Muslims who, for the most part, were born and raised in the UK, in contrast to their parents or grandparents who tended to emigrate to that part of the world in the 1960s and 70s. Primarily in the case of the UK from South Asia, 70% of the roughly 2 million Muslims living in the UK today hail from the Indian subcontinent, primarily from Pakistan, Bangladesh, and India, primarily Bangladesh and Pakistan. And among that first generation of immigrants, there was a tendency to hold quite fast and tight to senses of religious worldview, practices, religious life practices, sectarian issues and tensions that were present in the homeland countries from which they emigrated. So for example, in South Asian Islam, there's a broad sort of macro level distinction often drawn between somewhat more conservative scripturalist Deobandis and the more mystical Sufi-oriented Barelvis. And this distinction between Deobandis and Barelvis replicated itself very strongly within the UK, such that when we look at Muslim families living in the suburbs of post-industrial northern English cities such as Bradford, living together in the same neighborhood, if one family happened to be Barelvi and the other Deobandi, they simply wouldn't speak to each other. It's as if they didn't exist. In short, the older generation tended to attempt to continue to lead their lives as Muslims as if they were living in Muslim majority societies, not really engaging the fact that the world around them had changed quite fundamentally, that the challenges and issues that they faced as a religious minority were things that they simply didn't engage. So for example, when it came to the provision of religious services, the sourcing of religious knowledge, imams in mosques, for example, the tendency within the older generation was for a preference to bring imams from Bangladesh and Pakistan to the UK on a kind of on seasonal tours. Right? So these guys would be brought in, dropped in the middle of Leeds and Leicester, not speaking English whatsoever, to cater for the religious sensibilities and needs of that older generation. Unsurprisingly, when the younger generation of British Muslims would go to talk to them, to visit them at the mosque, and would raise certain questions about the specific challenges that one faces as a young person in the UK, the imams in those mosques simply would not be able to engage with them. There was just utter alienation there. And that began the process, I think, of younger Muslims tending to feel alienated from their parents' idiom of religion. And what this sets in motion is a dynamic or a search, if you will. This is something that in earlier work, namely a book I wrote about 12 years ago called Reimagining the Umma, Transnational Muslim Politics, a search for what I term a universal Islam on the part of this younger generation. And it speaks to a sense in which young Muslims felt that their parents' understanding of religion was somehow not authentic, that it was more tainted by the cultural practices of Bangladeshi villages than being properly plugged into the trans-historical stream of authentic Islam. And so there was this desire within the younger generation to find a new idiom of Islam that would transcend the parochialism of what they saw in their parents' religious practice. And this universalism, when it becomes translated into social and political attitudes, and after all, I am a political scientist, so I tend to look for the social and political byproducts of these processes, translated into a social and political process. The search for universal Islam, I suggest in my work, and it leads potentially in one of two directions. And these are, of course, ideal type directions. They don't exactly represent social reality. One is an idiom of Islamic universalism that tends this younger generation towards an emphasis on the extent to which Islamic values are compatible with universal values. That the story of the norms and ethics that underpin Islam is a story about pluralism, tolerance of difference, compatibility with notions such as universal human rights. On the other end of that spectrum, that similar spectrum that searches for Islamic universalism, the quest for Islamic universalism turns into an interest and, in some degree, an obsession with the idea of grand global Islamic struggles. The idea Islamic universalism means plugging oneself into and taking as one's political imperatives the struggles that one's co-religionists face on a global level as a result of various forms of state oppression, tyranny, etc., etc., etc. Obviously, the politics that come out of those two different understandings of what Islamic universalism looks like would cut very different directions. In this more recent project, because what I've really just done for you is to essentially recap my first book. In this project that I'm working on now, I'm looking more specifically at the question of religious authority and the changing nature of religious authority in the Muslim world. At one level, we can talk about the ongoing fragmentation of traditional voices of religious authority, a decline in the monopoly of the ulama, that is, traditional religious scholars, to be the chief arbiters, custodians of Islamic knowledge. This is in and of itself, of course, nothing new. There have been variations of this decline in the ulama monopoly that my colleagues from the field of history can speak to far better than I, that go back certainly into the colonial period. But to emphasize in this work, as I do, particularly the fact that the public spheres, the public spaces via new media, internet, satellite television, the channels, as it were, that are available for a plethora of competing voices, competing claimants to Islamic authority to enter the Muslim public sphere and to claim to speak on behalf of what is correct in Islam and to build followers and constituencies for themselves, this has changed quite dramatically in recent years. And I should flag up front that this shift towards the emphasis on new media, internet, satellite TV, does not simply spell the death of the relevance of traditional scholarship. Indeed, there are a good number of well-known traditional scholars who have been very enterprising and very skilled at building hubs for themselves within new media spaces. One thinks, of course, for example, of figures such as Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi, who became a household name on Al Jazeera television in the Middle East in the mid-1990s, although he'd been a major figure on the landscape of Islamic authority since at least the 1960s. His innovative use of satellite television as a space in which to kind of reclaim the universalistic remit of the alim, of the traditional scholar, outside of the easy hands of state censors. Although if you've been following recent developments around his well-known website, Islam Online, in recent weeks, you'll know that there has been something of a coup d'etat that's taken place within Islam Online, with a number of the more conservatively inclined scholars of the Qatari religious establishment essentially pushing the moderates off the board of directors of Islam Online. So, interesting politics around this. What I'm pointing to in this work primarily is new patterns of consuming Islam. I haven't found a nice, pithy hook that I'm going to use to sell this all yet. The one I've actually been working with, I deeply despise myself, and every time I use the phrase, a chill runs down my spine when I use it. But I'll throw it out there just because it's useful for the time being. What I'm pointing to in this work is the rise of what I'm calling iPod Islam. What do I mean by iPod Islam? Well, we all, particularly in the generation, carry around these devices, right? And on these devices are stored all manner of images, songs, fragments of media, videos, whatever. And they're from all over the place. I'll bet if you opened any one of your iPods and looked through the media on it and tried to make sense of who you are, you would find things that were incongruent. That this piece here shouldn't be laying alongside that piece there. You know, why do you have a Lady Gaga video and a collection of hadith on your iPod at the same time? And yet, somehow that works. Not entirely sure what the nature of that works is, but it is. And I'm not just talking about the juxtaposition of, say, American consumer pop music and, you know, and quote-unquote traditional religious knowledge. I'm focused really specifically in the realm of religious knowledge. And what I'm talking to here is a shift in the ways in which we consume religion. If you want to call it something else, you can call it the rise of, for better or for worse, soundbite Islam. And what it speaks to, I think, is the rise of a somewhat more pragmatic orientation on the part of consumers of religious knowledge. A shift away from the idea that I follow Sheikh whoever. And so when I look at my sources, it's all about compatibility with Sheikh whoever. And whenever I have a question or have a need in the realm of religion, I will go to Sheikh whoever. But more the idea that, you know, when I have questions about matters of aqidah, you know, central creedal tenets of faith, I'll go to this guy. You know, when I want a nice nasheed to listen to, I'll go to that guy. When I need some, you know, spiritual buoying up, you know, Sheikh Hamza Yusuf is my go-to guy. And these are potentially figures, if you look at who they are, and the theological currents of thought that they represent. They are sometimes figures who are supposedly not supposed to be able to coexist alongside each other in terms of the theological underpinnings of their work. But yet, who are, in our individual curations of Islamic knowledge, rendered pragmatically compatible. They work for us because we're not so worried about consistency across method. Rather, we're approaching this in a sort of troubleshooting fashion. I have this issue or need now, and I will go to this source in order to use it and make sense of it. So this rise of iPod Islam that I'm talking about speaks to this idea of the kind of the enormous upswelling of this multiplicity of voices. I've spoken, for example, obviously about you know, I've thrown out the term sheikh in invoking, you know, ulama and classically trained religious scholars. Of course, what we see is the emergence in recent years of all kinds of new claimants to something like religious authority, or who claim to speak on behalf of Islam, who do not at all fit the traditional mold of a religious scholar. One thinks, of course, of figures such as Amr Khalid out of Egypt, now based in the UK, Zakir Naik, who runs Peace TV out of Mumbai. And Zakir Naik, I think, is a particularly interesting figure, enormously popular with the South Asian constituencies that I focus on in this work. Indeed, the government has, of course, an entire research unit devoted to researching like mad the changing religious tastes of British Muslims. They have like these charts where they figure out who's up and who's down in any given week. You know, the sort of top 10 ulama of the week, or the top 10 media sheikhs of the week. And they released a report last week that suggests that Zakir Naik really has consolidated his role among a number of demographic communities as this incredibly popular figure, which to me, you know, depending on what you do and don't know about the religious discourse of Zakir Naik, is frankly a worrying trend. Zakir Naik is not a religious scholar in any sense. He's a medical doctor by training. He has a photographic memory and has memorized Quran, Hadith, you know, in exact verbatim detail, but likewise he's memorized Christian and Jewish sources in great detail. And so he stands up there and under the guise of what he calls comparative religion, although it's not really comparative religion, he's not putting religions into a conversation with each other so that the commonalities between them can be brought out. it's comparative religion that leads to determining that Islam is always correct. It's a form of Islamic supremacism that masquerades as comparative religion. And he stands up there and he quotes from Quran and Hadith, and then gives you verbatim, very detailed quotations off the top of his head from the Bible, and challenges those who have the books in front of them. Am I right? Am I right? Yes, I am right. And he's very impressive in the intense kind of rationalism and reasoning that underpins his work. When you ask those who follow his message, what is it that they're drawn to? You know, what they speak to is methodology. The fact that this is someone working with a sort of techno-scientific rationalist worldview that systematically works through problems by drawing on evidence and sources in a very comprehensive way. And that's what's appreciated about him, more so than the fact that he does or does not, in this case does not, hold an ijazah from a traditional center of Islamic learning. So you have the spaces for figures of Ahmad Khalid and Zakir Naik's ilk to be out there today. But of course, there is also people who do have those traditional scholarly credentials. And Sheikh Hamza Yusuf, of course, is the major figure here, tremendously popular both in North America and in Europe. Indeed, one thing that I think that I see going on today that's very, very interesting and also potentially positive, depending on how it spins out, is the fact that there has been in recent years an upsurge in interest in something that we might loosely term neo-Salafism, a new interest in the Salafi theological current, but also coupled with an upsurge in interest in neo-traditionalism, Sufism. Now these two things, Sufism and Salafism, traditionally have been thought to be at odds with each other. They're not supposed to work. In particular, Salafis are meant to be highly skeptical, if not outright rejecting, of many of the practices that underpin Sufism. Within what I'm terming neo-Salafism and neo-traditionalism, however, what I think you begin to see is something of a synthesis of the two, or at least the making of odd bedfellows. Insofar as the contemporary figures who represent these two approaches, I think, find themselves facing and trying to deal with a similar problem, i.e., in the face of these non-traditionally trained claimants to religious authority of the likes of Ahmad Khalid and Zakir Naik, in the face of jihadi figures who toss these decontextualized tidbits of Quran out there for eager kids who want to blow things up to try and make sense of, the Salafis and the Sufis say to each other, you know what, we have a vested interest in getting these kids regrounded in traditional Islamic scholarship once again. And so you find instances where Salafi figures and Sufi figures will appear next to each other on platforms, and they'll make nice to each other and show respect to each other and focus more on the similarities between them rather than the issues that divide them. Even more interesting to me is the emergence of figures that really reject the idea that they can be categorized as Sufis or Salafis, that try and draw the contours of an entirely different ecology of theological current, and as I'll go on to speak to in a moment, a different kind of social movement. And it's that kind of figure, and the first example of which I'm going to be put up here, from which I derive my reference point of someone who I consider to be a cool sheikh, and that's our good buddy Imam Suhaib Webb. A convert to Islam who hails originally from central Oklahoma. In his past, there's some background as a professional disc jockey. So Professor Haddad has hope of finding his way to this kind of future. Some run-ins with crime, drugs, and then he comes to Islam. And the life goes in a very different direction. He becomes an imam in a mosque in the Midwest, and eventually decides to pack up his family and move to Cairo, where for the last few years he's been studying at the venerable institution of Al-Azhar, while at the same time building an enormous following for himself, particularly among young Muslims in the West. In the UK, he's an enormously popular figure. And indeed, what makes him so popular, I would contend, are kind of two dimensions of his religious discourse. First is the fact that he resists easy categorization in terms of his theological orientation. He's quite happy to entertain and even speak on the virtues of Sufism as a variation of religious experience, a little more wary on the sort of tariqat, disciplinary bay'ah, oath to the sheikh, the veneration of saints type stuff. But the idea of Sufism as an approach to religious experience, he's down with that. And at the same time, in terms of his fiqh, in terms of his jurisprudence, he's a fair, he's a middle of the road Salafi. He rejects the idea that you have to hold strictly to one or any of the jurisprudential schools, but rather he peddles something that we might think of in terms of a soft Salafism, and the importance of being grounded in traditional authentic sources. But I think what particularly makes him appealing is when you see him speak, what you see is a figure who is capable, by virtue of his experiences on the street, his run-ins with the law, the problems he experienced in his younger years. There's a certain streetwiseness, a certain street cred in his religious discourse. And he can, on a dime, he can turn from speaking beautiful Fusha, classical Arabic, Quranic quotations, citations from traditional jurisprudence, and from right there, he can become the boy in the hood on the turn of a dime. And take that Quranic citation and explain why that trans-historical transplant from Mecca or Medina has a direct value added to some particular challenge that some kid living on crime-ridden streets in northern England is facing. And it's this ability, I think, that is something to watch and be aware of in the religious discourse of these figures that I'm talking about. He himself, and a lot of the religious scholars, and I'm going to get on to the more political and social movement stuff in a moment. Figures like Suhaib Webb, as I said, he's resisted the idea that he's part of any sort of particular theological current. But what you persistently see him do, and this will be my first hip-hop reference of the afternoon, is that he, on his blog, repeatedly calls for the establishment of what he calls a Wu-Tang clan of Islamic scholarship. And I don't know how familiar you are with the Wu-Tang clan as a group of performers. They were a group of New York-based rappers and hip-hop artists, kind of in the late 80s and early 90s, who for the most part managed to resist being strongly captured by any of the major hip-hop and rap formations, either on the street or in the corporate world, that were from the mid-90s very quickly colonizing hip-hop as a genre of cultural production. They remained fiercely independent. And what Suhaib Webb is, I think, trying to suggest is that what we need today in the Muslim world is the growth of a set of figures who don't have clear, easy connections that are reducible to being able to say, oh, that guy, that's a Muslim Brotherhood scholar, or that's an Al-Qaeda linked guy, or that guy is a representative of the official Turkish state Islam, or that guy's that. But rather the cultivation of a set of globally based figures from all walks of life who are, in his view, kind of tuned to a sort of fiercely independent but historically grounded Islamic scholarship. And I think that kind of appeal, that kind of message, when we talk about the realm of traditional scholarship, is enormously appealing to young people today. Of course, my interest is in the political side of things. And what I've become increasingly interested in of late is a theme that has been present and where I think some of the most important scholarship written to date on has been done by our own Professor Jamil Aydin, which is the idea of Islam as a form of counter-hegemonic discourse. Now, when we look out in the world today and we wonder about what Islamic manifestations of counter-hegemony look like, i.e. that is Islamic movements that sort of declare themselves to be against the present shape of the world and configurations of world power, it's not unnatural that our mind tends to leap fairly quickly to the likes of Osama bin Laden, Amin Zawahiri, and Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda is one story of Islamic counter-hegemony, but it's only one of many. What I'm doing in this book, in part, in some of the other chapters, is to explore the emergence of linkages between Islamic movements and the global justice / anti-globalization movement, connections between Islamic movements and the Green movement, attempts on the part of various groups to kind of transcend communitarian boundaries. The work of certain scholars, such as Tariq Ramadan, Hamid Dabashi, although those two are odd bedfellows to say the least, but both figures who are convinced in their own ways that you can create something like an Islamic liberation theology. The South African scholar Farid Essak would be another example of this. And this is all very interesting, but the sort of progressive Islam that it creates is, of course, in some ways very narrow. It doesn't necessarily have incredibly wide appeal. What I'm interested in is the question of what that project tuned to the urban contexts of late 20th, early 20th century Britain looks like. What does a contemporary British Islamic, to use the term of the Chicago-based activist Rami Nashashibi, what does a British Islamic ghetto cosmopolitanism look like? And what first got me interested in this is when I would be doing, for example, focus group interviews with young South Asian men in northern English cities, Bradford, Leeds, Manchester, etc. And I would ask them, where do you turn to find some resonance of your life? Where do you turn to find inspiration, guidance in sort of how to engage the world, or examples of other people, feeling and living your life? Their answers, of course, very rarely referred to the likes of Sheikh Yusuf Qaradawi or any religious figures or Islamic movements in the Muslim world. The vast majority of their answers referred to the Black American inner city experience. That's where young South Asians turn to find some resonance of the lives that they face on a day-to-day basis. Indeed, many of them understood themselves to be involved in a civil rights struggle of a sort, whose legal specificities look, of course, very differently than the civil rights struggle that African Americans faced in this country in the 1960s, but who understand themselves to be doing part of that. Now, and of course, Islam was part of that story in the United States as well. Islam played a counter-hegemonic role in the context of the civil rights struggle. One has to only think of the pivotal figure Malcolm X, Malik Shabazz, whose reinvigoration we'll touch on in a moment. So this is also a transatlantic story that dates back well over a century. One can think of certain kinds of resonances between the Pan-Islamic movement and the Pan-Africanist movement in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And this is where I start to kind of track my way towards the kind of hip-hop dimension of things. Before we talk about something that would be called, quote-unquote, Islamic hip-hop, a terminology that I'm kind of uncomfortable with because I'm not sure what it means for hip-hop to be uniquely Islamic. But let's talk about the interface and the encounter between Islam and hip-hop. Long before you had acts that designated themselves as Muslim hip-hop artists or producing music that they called Islamic hip-hop, you had an ongoing relationship between Islam of a sort, and the American hip-hop movement. Indeed, a good number of major American-based hip-hop artists and rappers, figures like Mos Def, and today some of the most popular figures like Lupe Fiasco, who we'll hear from in a moment, are quite open about their religious convictions. They consider themselves to be Muslim, although the pressures of being involved in corporate hip-hop has meant that you don't really get the religious message in the music so much. I've lost count of the number of times that Lupe Fiasco has declared that his religious convictions are incompatible with his professional lifestyle, and this album is going to be my last. This concert will be my last. He keeps coming back, but you know, that's in his blood. One thinks, of course, of the Nation of Islam movement. One thinks, of course, of the 5 percenters and the number of major artists, including many of the members of the Wu-Tang Clan, who consider themselves to be 5 percenters. The 5 percenters were a faction. If you thought the Nation of Islam was a heterodox Islamic movement, the Nation of Islam, the 5 percenters thought that the Nation of Islam was too mainstream, and so they broke off from them in the 1960s. The pivotal figure being a guy named Malcolm 13X. The 5 percenter movement, I guess we'd have to use Marshall Hodgson's language here and call the 5 percenters an Islamic movement rather than anything that to many practitioners of Orthodox Islam would look like Islam, but there is a clear relationship there. And there are a number of figures from the Wu-Tang Clan to the Fugees who invoke and refer to 5 percenter imagery in their music. In more recent years, we've had the emergence of an avowed movement, or Muslim hip-hop movement, in both the United States and the UK. I'll give you one clip of its North American variant here. This is Lupe Fiasco's remix of his benefactor Kanye West's track Jesus Walks, restyled here as Muhammad Walks. So we get Malcolm X, civil rights, quotations at the beginning.
All my brothers and sisters died. Abraham talked, Muhammad talked, and Moses split the sea. I ain't trying to profit off the profits, so this money is free. G's up, along with Muhammad and Jesus. In the Quran, they call him Isa. Don't think Osama is Saddam as I lead up. We pray for peace, but the drama entries us all. So we fall for the illusions of the beast. So instead of trying to teach, you show IT. Same God, different beliefs. Hijab, Sunday clothes, yarmulke, kufi. Same mission belief. We all trying to get to where the suffering ends. In front of the Most High, being judged by our sins. In front of the Most High, so the struggle contend. Use you, every beat, bird, and tree. He, her, and me. We virtually on the same boat with the same good.
You get the general picture. I'd be happy to, anyone wants the MP3, you might have heard the throwaway line there, I ain't trying to profit from the profit, so this one's for free. So this is a free MP3 that Lupe is quite happy for us to download and to distribute. If you'd like it, just let me know and I'll send you a copy of it. Things, I think, are even more interesting in the UK, where the Muslim hip-hop movement, I think, in some ways is more organically linked to some of the street struggles that Muslims in that country, particularly from the Afro-Caribbean, more so than the South Asian Muslim community, face. Indeed, there is a highly racialized politics present within the British Muslim hip-hop movement. It has certain institutionalized spaces. On the first Thursday of every month, this event called Rebel Music, which on the face of it, you would not necessarily think is an Islamic hip-hop event. This takes place in West London every month. 90% of the performers, who are a mixture of hip-hop, spoken word artists, rappers, 90% of them, I'd say, self-identify as Muslims, and those that don't understand themselves to be engaged and working in coalition with these Muslim artists around a series of struggles related to human rights, civil rights, and the deleterious effects of new forms of world imperialism, etc., etc. The sort of choreographers of this event are a band called Blind Alphabets.
Yeah, concrete lands, Kaiser, blind alpha. This is real life engraved on my pages, yeah.
Families are dying from starvation, whilst the government's more worried about immigration. Only holding 2% of the world's population. You need to think of what's important, life of the wealth of a nation. Men, women, and children with no goals. Once upon a time, lived in a land purely made of gold. I see ghosts that are stuck in limbo, crying for eternity. When generations like this, there's no concern for humanity. Troops fighting over oil because their presidents planned us to cause a global turmoil. Kids becoming generals because a year ago they saw their mother and father being slaughtered by devils. Seeing mutilated carcasses is now an everyday thing, because there's nobody taking charge of what's been happening. We genuinely want the world to get along instead of making ways to uphold our woman.
Alongside with them is a mostly spoken word act, poetic pilgrimage. Two young women who actually recently toured the United States on a quite successful tour. You can see up there by the lyrics, you get a sort of sense of the sorts of issues and problems that they engage. And you can see sort of certain thematic continuities from Lupe Fiasco through to Blind Alphabets to this work. Even when we come to the question of radical Islam and veering toward the realm of Islamic militancy, hip-hop remains current. I was struck by the fact that last week NPR did a piece on what they called jihadi cool, that some of you might have noticed. My work on this has focused primarily on the radical Islamic movement Hizb ut-Tahrir, which has been very popular in the UK. Well, popular has been very prominent in the UK since about the 1990s. Their political project is sort of al-Qaeda without the violence. It's the idea about collective mobilization towards the reestablishment of the caliphate, a sort of centralized global Islamic political institution. They've done a very good job recruiting for themselves in the UK by trying to take the sort of liminal, hybrid, hyphenated identities of young, confused South Asian men who are never allowed to feel totally British and also never accepted when they go to visit Pakistan as truly Pakistani, sort of caught between identities and cultures. And Hizb ut-Tahrir does a very good job of kind of reorienting their identities and convictions and commitments politically to some notion of a globalized Muslim identity. And of course, Hizb ut-Tahrir has its own hip-hop now. Blackstone, although my sort of sources in the UK tell me that Blackstone has recently moved away from Hizb ut-Tahrir, potentially in some very positive directions in terms of the work that they're getting involved in now. This is a tune that they released a few years ago called Rock Hard. And their music is used as a kind of recruitment tool among some of the recruitment circles, the halakas, the reading circles that are now run even for teenagers. This is a recent move on the part of Hizb ut-Tahrir to start kind of reaching into the 13 to 16-year-old crowd to kind of start pulling them into the music.
I ain't just a rock, see, I'm part of your earth, your soil, giving birth to your olive trees, making your oil. I've been shelter for the dead martyrs, mothers who toil laid to rest with a holy natures. Love those the best, I'm the defense of your women folk. When they arrest them and undress them, what you waiting for? Now pick me up, pebble rebel, I'm your lock star. You're smoking barrel, I'm the bullet for your slingshot. Must have a barrel, choose me. I was a part of a bigger road. Salahuddin's army catapults, they threw me over. That's my city. Yeah, I lost a bit away, but bleeding is the new black. You deny me my faith, yeah. I want it back. I don't need to sell myself, but see, these armored tanks, they ain't nothing, bro. You scared of me, newfound hero, yeah, ground zero, the foundation of the nation. So Allah Ta'ala's best creation, what's it gonna be? Little man, let me rock, bring them tanks, I don't give a stuff. I shout at beer, they've been crushing me for years now. No fear, now pick me up and wipe your tears back. You hear?
So the protagonist of the song is a rock, stone, in Jerusalem. The stone is speaking to a young Palestinian saying, pick me up and throw me against that Israeli tank. By doing so, you will not just be fighting the occupation. By picking me up, you will connect yourself to a trans-historical struggle that's been going on for years, because you see me now as just this rock, but I'm a fragment of a boulder that the great Islamic military leader Salahuddin used when he sieged Jerusalem all those centuries ago. You connect yourself to that experience, and the sort of message and the sort of activism that it begins to advocate gets more and more graphic towards the end. So, you know, this Islamic hip-hop thing is present from everything from a sort of progressive political discourse that is expressing broad discontent with contemporary geopolitics and geoeconomics and gender constructions, right the way through to techniques that are used for recruitment into radical movements. We have even more extreme stuff that I can't even begin to get into here. The burgeoning elements of a Muslim punk movement, seen in the work of people like Michael Muhammad Knight, and well, I don't know if it's well known, but it does exist example of a Muslim punk music group called the Kaminas. And these guys have styled themselves essentially as Sufi anarchists. They're kind of trying to tease out of Sufism an anarchist political project. Now, and you'll be happy to know that I'm about kind of 2 minutes away from concluding now. When it comes to the question of the ways in which some of the pop cultural product has been mobilized around and used in the context of political movements, this of course has not gone unnoticed, either within the Muslim community of the UK or on the part of the British state. The British government is well aware of the fact that there are these renditions, articulations of Islam that don't really fall anywhere on their radar of what they understand Islam to be, that are important tectonic forces at work in the community. And so you've seen in recent years the forging of interesting partnerships between certain segments of the Muslim community in the UK and the British state to try and do something about it. Now, unsurprisingly, most of, and this really to my mind is the most unfortunate piece of it, most of this effort has not been marshaled in response to the very real social problems that Muslim communities in, say, northern England face. Where, you know, when you go to Muslim communities in Bradford, Leeds, and ask them what are the problems you face in your community, it's drugs, gangs, unemployment. Radicalism? Yeah, it's in the mix, but, you know, let's put that in perspective. When the British government engaged with this stuff, of course, and not unsurprisingly, it's all focused on the counter-radicalization / preventing violent extremism message. And so what they've done in a fairly recent initiative, and again, this is all funded by the British government, this is an initiative called the Radical Middle Way, and I urge you to go check out their website. What they essentially did was they partnered with a number of figures who, these are guys in their mainly late 30s now, who some years ago were at one point maybe members of the Muslim Brotherhood of the Jamaat-e-Islami, at least a couple of whom had spent time in training camps in South Asia and then kind of pulled back from that and kind of took their religious life and experience in a different direction. And they've partnered with the British government to kind of try and repackage elements of this appealing discourse that I've laid out in ways that tries to, in their view, promote a kind of more constructive engagement with religion while simultaneously recognizing that young Muslims want to be radical. Hence, the radical middle way, i.e., you can be radical but moderate at the same time. And so what this formula essentially is it takes bits of Sufism, spitting light, nur, healing the hood. It takes elements of kind of social consciousness, the urban experience, African American power, and hip-hop, and kind of packages these things all together. Traditional Sufi scholarship, social justice consciousness, and hip-hop. And it runs these road shows that involve groups like Poetic Pilgrimage that we just heard from, up and down the UK, deliberately kind of trying to reinvigorate figures like Malcolm X, to kind of say, look, Malcolm X is an example of what a politically engaged Muslim consciousness, constructively engaged Muslim consciousness could be. And of course, they're pointing not to the Malcolm X of the height of the Nation of Islam's rejectionist stance, but rather Malcolm X at the very end of his career, when he'd gone on Hajj and kind of returned from that experience, transformed into more of a spiritual cosmopolitan, where he said, look, I still have my political convictions. I'm still a civil rights activist, but I can work alongside anyone who shares that same set of concerns with injustice, regardless of the color of your skin. And trying through this roadshow to kind of promote the idea that in every young, struggling British Asian Muslim, there is a little bit of Malcolm X. I mean, I have my own critique of this entire effort and project and the politics or lack of politics that it ultimately produces. What I'm mainly trying to give you here is a sense of how these issues are being tackled. What comes out of this, the big question that comes out of this for me, and of course this is not, so I'm not going to give you a conclusion to the research. I don't have a finding to communicate to you at this time. What this brings up to me is a question about what does this mean for the future of Islamic activism? What does collective social mobilization in the name of Islam, and particularly Islam understood as a form of a discourse of social change, what does that look like moving forward? Are we transcending the traditional ecology of Islamist ideological movements and theological currents? And what sort of landscape are we moving into now? And so the book that I'm working on is essentially primarily trying to answer that question. So I will leave it at that and greatly welcome your reactions and thoughts and questions. Thank you. Thank you very much. How do you want to? That's up to you. Yeah, I'm happy to kind of free form.
You know, as I was listening to your talk, I was reminded of this movie that came out a while ago called Commitments about, has anyone ever seen that movie?
Yes.
About, these Irish projects kids who end up identifying with or wanting to celebrate their presence at the bottom end of the socioeconomic ladder by identifying with blacks and with soul and pop music and playing these great classics of Motown in their band to escape their kind of slum reality.
Right.
There's so much race in what you have talked about,
yes.
It seems to me. And I was just wondering how that plays out. I mean, does anyone who's oppressed in England sort of latch on to the African American experience and appropriate it as a metaphor for their own position within British society, whether they're whiter than white Irish kids from Dublin or South Asian Muslims in Manchester? How does race play out in these communities? Because Muslim communities are often very fraught with racial tension.
Yes.
So is there any kind of great distance they have to leap to kind of identify with things black or?
Yes. Yes. No, it's a great question. I mean, race is, the more the project develops, the more it's becoming a project about race. And I'm feeling I need to kind of retrain myself in certain aspects, just because it's literature that I'm aware of, but I've never worked in that space before. It's in the UK context. There's two dimensions to it. It's not just I'm at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder and feel oppressed, and therefore I'm black. It's obviously in the case of most of the communities I'm working with, race has already been a dimension of the British Muslim experience. Indeed, and that's kind of part of the story that I'm telling, is in that, when you looked at how British Muslims were portrayed and talked about in the 1970s and 1980s and even through most of the 90s, it was all racial and ethnic language, right? These were Pakis, right? Darkies. Post 9/11, they suddenly become reinvented as Muslims. Islam becomes sort of ethnicized. And yet at the same time, the sort of day-to-day experience bears strong traces of what was and continues to be a strongly racialized experience. So there is the fact that direct experience of race and racism is part of the backdrop that these communities deal with. But I think you're also pointing towards the presence of strong racial dynamics within the community itself, which are strongly important. And you see it, you know, when I go to like the East London Mosque, which is in a heavily Bengali area of London, and you get some of the Afro-Caribbean performers who come in and they do their thing and they pour their heart out, you know, and the Bengali kids just look at them like, what the hell are these guys? What are they doing? You know, and it's not that there's this instant recognition of, oh, this is a message for me and about my life. The racial identification works more effectively transatlantically, interestingly enough. And so, for example, this radical middle way group, when it wants to kind of tap into that, it tends to bring major African American Islamic figures over to the UK to talk to these kids. Just because the sort of experience they're narrating, particularly for the sort of urban Northern England kids, is something that they tend to pick up on immediately. But you're absolutely right. It's not just that race is present, but there's a sort of multi-dimensional race issue here. It's not just the fact that Muslim minorities in the UK face a set of challenges around race, but the persistence of racial issues within the community. And let's not even, I mean, we haven't even touched the presence of race as the central cleavage within the American Muslim community. That's a whole different story that, you know, will be treated somewhere in the book, I think. But you're absolutely right to raise the centrality of that.
Following on what you said a little bit, I was wondering how, maybe not just race but also class. I mean, how does that affect, let's say, how they perceive someone like Hamza Yusuf, who comes from a fairly privileged background, right? Or someone who's an American convert, not like Sahib Webb, who has this kind of hood background, right? But someone who's a convert but comes from a very privileged background. I mean, does that affect how they identify with them at all? Or?
My sense is that yes, it does quite strongly. That you know, and when you see these guys speak, you'll see them very consciously try to restyle themselves for different audiences. But someone like Hamza Yusuf really is trying to, I think, in his religio-political discourse, trying to transcend that. And although he can't entirely, and you know, there's a version of his speeches that try to get a little street, you know, and it doesn't always work. You know, when I often go to them and I'll go to those speeches and I'll talk to people afterwards. What did you think? And yeah, elements of it work. Others feel a little forced, a little contrived. But you definitely see a class dimension of this too, particularly in the reception of figures such as Tariq Ramadan, right? You know, Tariq Ramadan does not speak to the disenfranchised kid on the street of Bradford. It just doesn't work. It's too philosophical. It's middle professional class Muslim talking to other middle class professional Muslim, right? What becomes important, I think, is in terms of the relevance of Tariq Ramadan's message. And I'll put in a shameless plug for his appearance. It's not shameless because Mason is involved very directly. The Ali Vural Ak Center for Islamic Studies is co-sponsoring the annual conference of the Center for the Study of Islam and Democracy on April 28th. And Tariq Ramadan will be the keynote speaker. You may know that he has until very recently been banned from the United States for reasons that are bizarre and that we won't even get into. But he will be addressing that conference, so I hope many of you will attend. It's downtown at the Ronald Reagan building on 14th Street. What's important about Tariq Ramadan in terms of the relevance of his message is that in addition to having a direct audience with some of the professional class shakers and movers and opinion makers in the British Muslim community, there is a set of figures in local communities who act as translation figures. They are people who are themselves sort of middle-class backgrounds who can access his work, and they take it and they translate those bits of it that are relevant to, again, you know, street life in Leeds. And in that way, they do channel his work. So while it's not directly listened to, it's not read, it's not, people don't actively seek him out, you know, from working class backgrounds, there is some mobilization and translation of his work into a language and an idiom that does speak to their conditions.
Well, part of the story of the Black Muslim movement uses a community organizing tool. Is that happening in England? That would be sort of a direct political relevance, or is that part of the story? It's not happening.
No, that's a great question. The answer is that it has been happening on a kind of fits and starts, in the UK at least, for the last 20 years. And more often than not, what happens is that it gets itself taken over and colonized by some of the large national-based Muslim organizations that suddenly claim the space to be the spokespeople of Islam, whether or not they're actually rooted in any given community. So I think, for example, of groups like the Muslim Council of Britain, which is a broad umbrella organization representing some 500 plus local to national level Muslim organizations, which became the sort of chief interlocutor of the British government in the wake of 9/11 and after the London bombings of 7/7/05. So there would be local groups that would kind of start to articulate their very specific community needs, and then the Muslim Council of Britain would step in and kind of say, oh, no, we're the Muslims you talk to, we'll tell you what our people need. And what it's become, I think, unfortunately, is a history of certain figures who have a vested interest in styling themselves as the official spokesvoices of Islam, often getting in the way of local Muslim communities with very specific needs, and community organizations that are more properly grounded, allowing their voices to be heard. This radical middle way effort would claim that part of what they're trying to do is to leave behind in all of the settings that they visit the contours and nucleus of what might eventually become a community or organizing effort. The problem is that they have so little manpower and are so much of their time and effort goes into organizing these itinerant shows that there's very little follow-on work that takes place in terms of making sure that those inspired young people in whatever setting know how to take the next steps in terms of mobilizing and building collective action efforts around their work. So it's happening. And in my view, the question of something successful coming out of this will depend on whether or not that it is able to play out with more effectiveness. My fear is that as much as the British government on the one hand likes to simulate the idea of community or organization and speak that rhetoric, I don't think the British government would actually be very comfortable with the politics that would come out of it. And so I think they're quite happy for these guys to be trotting around, inspiring young people for an evening before going on to the next city.
But I mean, it seems to me that the bigger issue is that the effort comes from the British government. And sort of this issue of umbrella organizations and representation is not just one of people wanting to speak for Islam, but for all European governments and to a degree the American government to having continuously asked for that kind of unified representation that also requires to self-identify as moderate.
Right.
And I mean, these seem to be very creative efforts. I don't know that the American government is doing anything sort of that creative in terms of sort of the repertoire that they're drawing from, but at the same time what it's tainted by primarily is not its content, it's where it's coming from.
Right. I mean, and two really crucial points there is that, this could not possibly be done in the United States. It would violate the United States Constitution, because part of what this involves is the British government taking, the Grand Mufti of Egypt and bringing him to the UK and saying, here, you want to talk about state establishment of a religion of a sort? That's exactly what it is. It just constitutionally, legally would not fly here. This point about European governments seeking to engage with, and where it's absent, to create an Islam to their liking is highly irrelevant here. And the British government has been thoroughly schizophrenic on this. Because on the one hand, they started with the Muslim Council of Britain, decided at some point that it was problematic and too a little Islamist-y, so they pushed them aside and said, oh, we're going to create this thing called the Sufi Muslim Council, because we want Sufis, because Sufis are cuddly and fuzzy and they're apolitical. That's the kind of Muslims we want. So yes, we'll fund them. And the Sufi Muslim Council exists and has, a grand total of about 4 members, as far as I can tell, but draws a ridiculous amount of money from the British government. what's interesting to me about these guys is that this began life as a partnership between Q News, the British Muslim magazine that had developed over 20 years a reputation of itself as being fiercely independent. It spoke truth to the British government and it spoke truth to the Muslim community, not beholden to any particular sectarian view. It was Q News combined with FOSIS, the Federation of Student Islamic Societies, whose roots actually lay in the Muslim Brotherhood and the Jamaat-e-Islami. So these are the group of Islamist moorings, and the British Home Office. I mean, talk about a bizarre combination of bedfellows. And of course, when going out to the community, they never hid the fact that there was British government funding behind it, but what they were trying to say is to say, look, if it's coming from the likes of FOSIS and Q News, you can trust it. You can engage it. These are not people that you could simply dismiss as creations, fictitious, moderate creations of the British government. And so I think it has allowed this project to gain a certain listening audience that it would not have had. My problem with it is that it does all the talk about an alternative politics, but they never make the next step of saying, all right, if you're concerned about issues in your community, here are NGOs. Not just Muslim NGOs, NGOs, advocacy organizations that are also concerned about inner city poverty. And here's how you can get involved to work with them. It's just this night-long, music fest, and it sounds great and it looks great, and boom, we're off to the next city. So I think you're right that this has been one of the more creative efforts, both in terms of how it's packaged and who's behind it. But at the end of the day, I think it falls short in terms of being empowering in any meaningful sense.
One of the things I see happening in the U.S. is that these kinds of cultural things, events, develop and move across boundaries. For example, the gangster rap of the black ghetto was then taken over by the white middle class as their music.
Right.
And is that sort of thing happening in England also?
Yes, yeah, it has. But I mean, I think the phenomenon you're referring to there is the taking of a cultural product whose origins lay in a particular slice of life experience that becomes culturally marked as edgy and cool in some way, which is then commodified, packaged and sold. So I remember 2 years ago, I went to a Kanye West concert out at Merriweather Post, no, not Merriweather, the Nissan Pavilion, right? It was white teenagers of Fairfax County and Loudoun County, were the attendees, and I just couldn't get away from that. What was around me, and what I wasn't quite sure what exactly I was experiencing. Whether that's present here, I mean, insofar as hip hop music has a following within, the non-Muslim, non-South Asian population of the UK, absolutely it does. And I don't think I can say that there isn't some dimension of the commodification element that is present within the consumption of this music within certain segments of the community. That said, I think that there is a different kind of engagement with it that goes on, and I see that mainly in terms of when I do these sort of long, in-depth interviews. You see a move, you see deliberate resonances and connections between the sorts of themes that are rehearsed in that music and the kinds of views and attitudes that underpin the kind of political attitudes that are articulated to me. Whereas, I'm not sure that I would hear exactly the same story about what's appealing in hip hop to, a 15-year-old from Fauquier County.
Anyone else?
I have a question, but before that, I want to put another shameless plug. On April 12th, we're showing a documentary called New Muslim Cool that chronicles the experience of a Puerto Rican Muslim rapper from Pittsburgh. It's a very appealing, very well done film that raises a lot of really interesting questions, not just about hip hop, but also about American Muslims, about race, about security issues. He works in the prison system, so I invite you to come and watch it. And the flyers are back there. Yes. And the question was, and I'm the resident expert having to ask that, is how does gender come into all of this? Because you said you speak to young Muslim men.
Yeah.
I think you said it several times.
No.
But then there were these two women, the spoken word.
Yeah. And they're always held up as, look, there's women doing it too. Where? These two. Well, there are at least two other women or all women acts that I know of, but the extent to which there's, oh, there are women too, it comes into it, I find, in very problematic ways. I see this both in some of the material I collect in the focus groups I do, and also some of the stories that some of the Muslim social workers who work with these kids tell me, that basically it serves to reproduce and reinforce a set of gender views, in that they will take the sort of South Asian views on gender that they inherit from their parents, couple that with the representations of women in gangster rap, and put those two together. You get something really, really ugly when you do that. But that's not Muslim hip hop en masse. And you know, part of what I was trying to communicate is the fact that this thing I'm labeling Muslim hip hop is itself internally very diverse. The rebel music event, you know, connects itself quite avowedly to progressive politics. You know, and a lot of the performance that you see, and the radical political wave would do the same thing as well. You know, is explicitly about challenging certain kind of formulations of gender. It's in more of the kind of inner city, northern English, Bradford, Leeds adoption of rap that you actually see the reinforcing of certain kinds of gender norms through the coupling of, you know, the discourse of woman from South Asian Islam with the discourse of bitches and hoes kind of coupled together.
Anyone else? Okay, well, please join me in thanking Dr. Mandaville one more time.